So now we will move on to topic 3.7 in the APUS history curriculum with a look at the Articles of Confederation, which was one of the most significant developments in the Revolutionary period. It and the various state governments were created from the debates about the role of government, which in turn helped shape the creation of those institutions and explicit clarification on the rights of the citizens. Before we take a look at the early national government, let's first look at the development of the state governments. This new American nation was going to be created following Republican ideals, whereby citizens, which really means white male landowners, would be represented by legislators who would make the major decisions for them. What they were creating was a representative democracy. And the key thing that they were trying to find was a balance between liberty and power. By 1777, most of the states had approved written constitutions, a written framework for government that was unique to each state, although they did share some common items. Each state constitution had a list of rights and basic freedoms that belonged to all citizens of that state. Each provided for a separation of powers, limiting what each part of the government could do. They had a legislative body whose members were elected, an executive who was elected as governor instead of having royally appointed governors and councils, and they each had a judiciary, a system of courts. Typically, the power of the governors was fairly weak and in some cases absent almost completely, and the powers of the legislatures were fairly strong. These state constitutions also included provisions for who was allowed to vote and who was allowed to hold office, which was generally white men who owned a certain amount of property, with office holders typically having stricter requirements. These state governments heavily influenced the creation of the Articles of Confederation. After Richard Henry Lee's Resolution for Independence was introduced, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania drew up a draft of a plan for a national government, and had an initial draft of the Articles of Confederation created as early as July of 1776. A committee then fine-tuned it, but it took until November of 1777 before the Congress as a whole approved the final version and submitted it to the states for ratification, and then it took until March of 1781 until all 13 states approved the new document and allowed this new government under the Articles to begin functioning. Until then, the Second Continental Congress was the de facto government of the United States. The states who had no western frontier held out on their approval the longest, with the dispute being over how to handle the division of the vast amount of land located to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. Once all of the other states who had those claims promised to give up those claims in the west to the national government, that is when the Articles of Confederation were finally ratified. The government that had been created by the Articles of Confederation was a loose association of states, highly protective of their liberties and often at odds with one another. They placed all of the power into the hands of a unicameral legislature that was answerable to the states and therefore to the voters in those states. The Confederation Congress was purposely weak in order to ensure that it did not violate the rights of the 13 states or the citizens, like Parliament and the monarchy had done. The Congress would have power over foreign affairs and resolving interstate disputes. It could approve treaties with other nations, but didn't actually have any power to enforce their terms. The Treaty of Paris, for example, had required the new United States to pay back its debts, including debts that were owed to British merchants, some of which dated back prior to the war itself. But with the Congress not having the power to tax the citizens, and because most of the states did not provide sufficient contributions to pay for the national government's expenses, the money that this Confederation Congress had access to just simply wasn't enough. So they responded by printing money, which had almost no value. The Articles of Confederation basically reflected the fears that the Americans had of a monarchy that had grown too powerful. They distrusted large governments, and the idea of having too much power vested in the hands of one individual meant that there was no president or other chief executive. And that became just one of its many weaknesses. Another was that it did not have a judicial system, nor any means of enforcing its laws. They also did not have the power to tax citizens. They would simply have to ask the states for funding, and states often ignored the requests of the Congress for finances. To pass laws, you needed 9 of the 13 states to approve them, and any changes to the articles themselves required all 13 states to vote in favor, large and small, slave and free. This meant that the articles were really a very rigid and unchangeable document. Other weaknesses of the articles were that the national government would not be able to regulate interstate or even foreign trade. And with many states printing their own money to try and pay down their own debts, inflation was a huge problem, but the Congress could do nothing about it. There was also threats from foreign countries that Congress couldn't address. Britain still occupied forts in the Ohio River Valley and traded weapons with Native Americans, potentially threatening American settlers out on the frontier. And since Congress couldn't raise money, there was no national army to deal with this violation of the Treaty of Paris. But again, remember, the United States is violating the Treaty of Paris too. Later on, Spain stopped allowing the U.S. to use the port of New Orleans and closed the Mississippi River to U.S. trade, which severely hurt people in frontier areas like Tennessee and Kentucky because the rivers were the only affordable means of transportation for them, since going overland over the Appalachian Mountains was simply too expensive. Still, the government under the Articles of Confederation was not without accomplishments. First, it did produce the Treaty of Paris, which was quite generous towards the Americans. Second, it produced the Land Ordinance of 1785, which provided for an orderly system of selling off and settling lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. It outlined a plan of land surveys and sales in what they called the Northwest Territory, which is the present-day states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. The land there would be divided into townships of 36 square miles each, laid out in grids. Each township was then divided into 36 sections, each section 640 acres or 1 square mile. And each section was further divided into farms, a half section or a quarter section being the most common purchased divisions. 4 of the sections were designated for use for government purposes, including 1 for public education. And 4 additional ones were held back from sale until the area was developed, as presumably this would bring a much higher price. The third major accomplishment of this government under the Articles was the passing of the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. Essentially, it was a plan for developing this territory into states. Before reaching that point, a territory would have a very limited form of government: a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges, all appointed by Congress. Once the population reached 5,000 adult males, a legislature could be elected. And when the population of free inhabitants reached 60,000 total, then the territory could create a state constitution and apply to Congress for statehood. Ohio would be the first territory to be granted statehood using this method. The language of the Northwest Ordinance, though, specifically prohibited slavery anywhere within the territory, and would require any escaped slave to be reclaimed by their owners. This push westward, though, while it did increase U.S. population and opportunities, increased tensions between the American settlers and Native Americans who were already living there. And the outlawing of slavery in the region increased tensions between the northern states and the southern states, which will grow much worse as time goes on. The flaws in the Articles of Confederation and its government really became apparent in 1786, when Shays' Rebellion broke out in western Massachusetts as a protest to rising debt and economic chaos. Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays led about 4,000 rebels in an uprising against what they perceived to be economic and civil rights injustices relating to new taxes and rising inflations. Merchants, who dominated the economy along the coast, and therefore dominated the legislature as well, demanded payments for goods in specie, meaning hard currency like gold, and refused to extend credit, especially to farmers in the interior portions of the state. Of course, part of the reason they did this is because they weren't getting credit by European suppliers. Nevertheless, though, the rural farming population was generally unable to meet these demands being made of them by merchants or the civil authorities, who wanted them to pay their taxes in gold as well, that the farmers simply didn't have. and so individuals began to lose their land and other possession when they were unable to fulfill these debt and tax obligations. Sometimes those debt and tax obligations having been caused by these men's service in the American Revolution. This would lead to strong resentment against tax collectors and the courts, where collectors and even tax collectors, as well as private creditors, could obtain judgments authorizing the seizure of property. And of course, many of these farmers were still owed money by the Confederation Congress as payment for their military service, which of course that Congress couldn't pay either. So Shays and his followers marched on courthouses to prevent them from issuing any judgments and confiscating any property. Massachusetts wanted help to put down this rebellion, but the national government could do nothing, and other states weren't willing to help either. Eventually, the rebellion did scatter, but that was when it was confronted by a private militia hired by the merchants along the East Coast. But the troubles of this incident made clear that there was serious weaknesses in the structure of the government that was created by the Articles of Confederation. And really, even before the chaos of the Shays' Rebellion got started, the economic issues that were problems under the Articles were beginning to be felt, particularly amongst society's elites. Recognizing especially that there was a problem with interstate commerce, George Washington hosted a meeting at his estate on Mount Vernon, which sits on the border between Maryland and Virginia. The meeting in 1785 was to discuss some of the trade problems between those two states. Pennsylvania and Delaware were also invited to be part of the discussions and agreements, though most of the focus was on the Potomac River. But the importance of this meeting was that it was a model of interstate cooperation outside of the Confederation Congress. But since they noted that there was other issues plaguing the young nation and Congress seemed powerless to act, these four states suggested that they host another conference the following year, inviting all of the states, to be held at Annapolis. Although all states were invited to Annapolis, only 5 actually sent delegates. Those who were there, though, discussed issues and developed a consensus about reversing some of the protectionist trade barriers that each state had erected towards all the other states. And really, the big situation here, the big outcome of this Annapolis Convention, is that the participants decided that a broader convention, a constitutional convention, really was needed, and they sought support for such an action by both the Confederation Congress as well as appealing to the states themselves. And with news of Shays' Rebellion breaking at about the same time that this request was going out, more states were likely to participate, and did, which is something that we will look into more in our next video.